This conference will now be recorded.
Are you able to edit these videos? Are you able to edit these videos? Or recording? Okay. I was saying, if I have to say something stupid, Okay, well, I guess I've been given permission to go ahead and get started. I think I met most all of you. I hopefully have. If not, come talk to me afterwards or during this thing. My name is Luke Quinn. I am the preacher over at the church in Wapaka. And I have a wife, Laura, who's not here right now. She's at home with two kids. I have a daughter named Aylin, who is almost 2, and a son named Luke II, who is about 7 months old. So hopefully they'll come with me next week, because as I understand it, this class is supposed to be a 4-week class. So this is the first of 4, and we'll do it the next consecutive Sunday night. So I'm looking forward to this. This is a class on ethics. And before I get into it, I want to just pass this sheet out for, I guess, I put 2 columns here for credit for audit. You can take this class for credit. This is through the ISB, the Institute of Studies in the Biblical Hajjah. And education. Yes. I don't know. That's Clinton later. I never did. And it was lucky I'm not wearing the tie right now.
The tie has it on there, so if you would have worn the tie, you know what it stood for.
Well, I don't like. Anyway, you can. I don't know why. If you're just taking it for audit, you're just here because you are going to be here anyway, and you don't really care about taking it for credit. I guess you don't have to do anything. But I'll just pass this around for those of you that want to take it for credit. If you could write your name and email address.
Yeah. If you put your email, I'll email the link once it's uploaded to YouTube. If you want to review it.
Right. You want to listen to it again.
How many tests are going to be in this?
Okay.
One final paper, right?
That's right. No tests. I hate tests, because I don't do very well. But what it'll be is we'll do a like Quentin said, it'll be basically a final. What I want is a 2 pages. You can make it as long as you want, really. But I'd say just set a standard minimum 2-page. And what I want it to be, it can be about actually quite a wide variety of things. I don't really want it to. I don't want to, I guess, constrict you, because maybe when we go about studying ethics, you'll have a certain subject or topic regarding, I guess, pertaining to the study that will interest you more than other things, and that might be something you would like to kind of hash out more for yourself. So really, anything that we cover in the class or anything related to the topic of ethics, you can make it. You can take like a moral dilemma or a moral issue. You can talk about, say, abortion or stem cell research, the things that a lot of people sometimes ask about regarding ethical practices. You can talk about a virtue. I'm very fond of I guess specifically the biblical information on certain virtues, like the virtue of courage or purity or something like that pertains to. So really, there's a wide variety of things you can write about, and hopefully, as we go through this material, you'll find subjects that you'd like to, like I said, kind of hash out on your own and learn more about by doing so. And that's really the thing about it is if you really want to learn something about something, then the best way to go about doing that is to try and in some form teach it. And if you're that would mean, of course, if you're in a position like me where I can actually stand here and teach it, or it could be something that, in a sense, you sort of start to teach yourself. Now, writing is a really key tool in doing that. If you're writing about something, then in a sense you're acting as if you are teaching it to someone, because maybe no one's going to read it, besides maybe me. I hope, however, that even if that's the case, that you'll be able to read through it yourself. Or in other words, you put it down on paper, and so it's I guess it's come out of your mind and it's been put in a more, I guess, logical form. And you can kind of understand something about your own thoughts that way when you write those down. So anyway, that's the rationale behind doing the paper instead of the test. There's sort of the free flow of ideas there that you wouldn't have otherwise. I don't think ethics is kind of a hard thing to test anyway. I mean, what sort of questions would I ask? Is it, is adultery a sin? Yes or no? Okay. We kind of, a lot of us at least, and don't take this too lightly though. A lot of us have a common starting point anyway when it comes to ethics. But I guess speaking of that, to kind of get into this, what is ethics anyway? And I guess I'll ask that question of you. When you think of the word ethics, what types of things do you think of?
Study of morality.
The study of morality, okay. That does cover it pretty well, I guess. Anything else? Anyone else? What do you think of? What are the associations you have with it?
I usually think of the behaviors that you have when no one is watching you and no one is ever going to find out what you did.
Okay, I like that. The behaviors you have when no one's watching you, no one's going to find out what you did.
The way that you behave in that situation.
Right. So I guess state of character in Aristotle's sense, which we'll talk about briefly, not just public morality, which any sort of politician I suppose could have, but that that's there's more to it than that, isn't there? There's the actual state of character that you have that perhaps only you and God know about. All right. So there's one thing in ethics, and oh yeah, go ahead. Tell me, what do you associate?
I was going to say too, when we were driving in, I was saying, okay, now say for example, they're doing all this sand drilling. It's legal and stuff, but it's harmful. They're finding out this is harmful. So if you, you legally can do it, but morally and ethically, is it a right thing to do?
And sand drilling was this particular.
Well, it's causing the environment. Anything it's destructive that.
It's the sand. Wisconsin is we're heading certain places in Wisconsin.
Mhm.
And they're using the sand for drilling
Right,
oil.
correct.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
It's big money, but is
Right.
it ethical to destroy our?
Okay.
Environment.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. Then it's a huge I guess area of ethics, isn't it? As you might say, environmental ethics, or thinking about not just your dealings with people, with individual people and persons, but also with, I guess, the environment you find yourself in. And underlying that discussion is the idea of human responsibility towards things, right? Not just towards other people or towards yourself or towards God, but also towards the creation that God has placed us on. That's great. The thing about this the study of ethics is that it really does encompass so many different things. And
We just watched a program on PBS on the Dead Sea,
yes.
and they're destroying that. It dropped to 15 feet in level
Mhm.
because they're using water before, and then behind there, knocking it off, and then they're taking all the salt out of there, and it's getting smaller, and plus the water level is way down,
Mhm.
and they don't know what to do. The people are living around there, and it's destroying the.
You know your topic to write about now,
Yeah.
don't you?
It's all about money.
I see. Yeah, well, and seriously, that could be, if you care to write about a topic. I don't know if you're taking it for credit or not, but that could be definitely something you write about. I'd be interested to hear more about it. Okay, so there's a man that I particularly want to introduce us to in starting this, the idea of the study of ethics, and his name is Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, most of us probably haven't heard about him. Quentin probably has, because he's heard about everything. And since he has, by the way, Quentin, I wanted to run this by you, and I'll do it in public, so that you have to say yes. There are some books on the psychology of moral development that are written by this guy. He's a psychologist, right? Now, you talked about kind of getting together a library for the school, right? Now, here's the reason I say this to you is because you're a doctor, and those books are very expensive, and I'd like to read them. So maybe if someone here associated with the school could buy them for us, then I would get to read them, and the school would get a few books, and nothing would happen to you whatsoever. But anyway, Lawrence Kohlberg he was an American, a Jewish American, and during the years following World War II, he worked as a merchant marine. And what he did was he helped smuggle a lot of Jews out of their countries and tried to put them into Israel, as the nation of Israel was starting to form. Now, this is really the point at which he started to think about moral questions and and how people, I guess, develop a moral worldview. And because he came up across a lot of different situations that caused him to think, I don't really have a standard by which I'll make moral decisions. Now, one particular example is that I can't remember who exactly caught them, but he was captured by some people trying to smuggle Jews out of their country, and he was captured. Now, and the crew was captured with him. Now, the moral dilemma he faced was that he had the opportunity to escape. The question was, should he stay there and help the people that he was already helping before? He was getting these people out of their country, and now they're captured and they're in this together. Should he stay there and be with them and support them, or should he go ahead and escape alone, as he had the opportunity to, so that he could go out and continue to I guess, take Jews out of their countries? Now, that was, one of the things that he faced the types of things he faced in his life, and he asked the question, he said, I really don't have any basis by which I would make these judgments. I don't know why I decided to do X over Y. And what he did, incidentally, was he did decide to escape, and he kept doing what he was doing. He kept smuggling out Jews. But there's one thing, and we'll talk about these types of things a lot in this class. I liked for it to be as practical as possible, because, well, for one thing, we don't really have too much time to talk about these things, and staying on the more conceptual theoretical level is good. I think we need to start there, so we'll start there tonight. But when you think about ethics, you didn't really mention any of the deep philosophical issues surrounding it. You mentioned very practical things about the environment, about your moral state of character, about basically just really the most practical type of thing you could study is what should you do every day in your life? What sort of principles should guide your specific particular actions? So that's the idea. And the thing is, a lot of us don't really have much of a standard by which we would make those decisions in I would say, the modern world. Go ahead.
Well, isn't that a difference between having scripture as a guidance and believing that morality and therefore ethics is something taught by God versus something developed by mankind for social living?
Yes. Now, well, and it's a complex question, isn't it? Because we can see in a lot of cases the pragmatic nature of the moral standards we do develop, right? I mean, if you think about it, and you can really trace this, take sexual morality, for instance. God has some pretty clear lines and clear rules in the scripture about, sexual morality, what you should do regarding sexuality and what you shouldn't do, right? Sex is only supposed to be between, two people, a man and a woman specifically, who are committed to each other for life, right? That's the God-given plan. Jesus talked about it in Matthew 19. It's established all the way in the beginning in Genesis 1, when God brought the woman out of man and put them together and said, what God has put, or what, as Jesus said, what God has put together, let no man tear asunder. Now, for us, it's very simple. Right? Why? Because people might ask the question, why is it that unmarried people can't have sex? Or why can't you decide to go ahead and leave that one partner you were with and go ahead and sleep with someone else? Or maybe even have another long-term relationship with that other person. And for us, it's so easy to say, well, God says not to do that. But I think this is introducing, and thank you for doing so, introducing what you might call the postmodern dilemma, which is, well, I suppose the authority of God and of the scriptures, of course, has been questioned. And that's some place we would want to start with people that, that the fact is a lot of people don't believe in God to begin with. And the fact is, even if most people do, in the United States at least, they believe in some sort of God and some sort of higher power, they may not particularly believe in the authority of the scriptures in their lives. But let's say, for argument's sake, and this is mostly my experience, that people often have a belief in God and they have a moral sense, and they do respect the Bible and they read it and study it, but they still wonder, why does God say I can't do this? And that's, I think, the question for us as Christians. And this, I should say, this isn't just an ethics class, right? It's a Christian ethics class. This is specifically for us as people who follow the Christ, who follow God and His Word. How do we go about making these decisions for ourselves? Of course, we base it on the authority of God. But I think one thing is that we need to think about is how we look out towards the community around us, or the world around us. The world around us is very different from the world of, say, 50, 100 years ago. A lot of these things wouldn't have needed to be discussed, right? and we are discussing a lot of them now. I think that's an issue. First of all, I think personally that whenever you have to talk about a moral issue, it's probably already too late, because it's obviously an issue. It's a problem when you have to talk about it. So I think that's definitely evident. But my approach with people, and I thought about this a lot, as a preacher, how do I approach non-Christians with these types of things? I mean, from their perspective, I'm coming up and I'm telling you can't do this, you can't do that. Basically, all the fun they had in their lives, as far as they can tell, is now illegal. Something you can't do. And the only question they're really asking is, well, why? What's the rationale for that? And I think it's a good question. And for me, going to someone who doesn't have a basis in the scriptures, I can't just start out by saying, well, God says so, right? There has to be a faith in God established. And that doesn't just mean, you might say, a propositional belief in the existence of God. That's not the same as faith. Faith is, in a sense, setting your heart on him and trusting in him. And so that's a relationship type thing. And I think also that the things that the scripture does teach, they can also be accessed through universally accessible principles. And what I mean by that is that there's a rational reason, as far as I am concerned, for, say, the sexual rules that God does lay down. He doesn't do it arbitrarily. There's a reason why he says certain things are wrong. And I think for the most part, we can discuss and find out why those things are. So simply saying, well, God says so, that's kind of, in my opinion, a cop-out. What we need to do, and this is what I think young people, especially today, need to hear from us, in the church as well, is why is this wrong? Not just telling me that it is and expecting me to follow it. We want to know why we're doing what we're doing, right? Yeah, I'm excited. What did you have to say?
Well, I was going to say, I think that gets down to that having a relationship with God is not necessarily the only pathway by which you can establish the superiority of God's plan. Just because of the fact that God designed us, he created us, and he designed these particular guidelines for our maximal success. And when you look at and I was thinking about this morning because, a lot of the world wants to behave like animals, but you can't. Humankind can't behave like animals because it ends up in disaster. And so you have to have a moral set of principles by which you, as human beings, we are not animals. And people want to behave in that way from a sexuality standpoint, but there's actually good data, good research that shows that the more sexually restrictive along godly guidelines that a society is, the more prosperous and successful that society is. I mean, if there's good, data and research outside of God saying don't do these things.
Right. The fact is, many other of the ancient cultures in the history of the world have had the same type of rules. Right? Not all the same as, say, the Jews in the Old Testament times, but many of the same ones. Monogamy has been the basic practice of human beings. If you take in the vast history of humankind, you can look at some of the more primal, less advanced tribes even today that have polygamy, but it really hasn't been the majority over time. And there's a reason for that. There's a pragmatic reason why one man and one woman just makes sense. And I think we can work through that, and that's where you can start with a lot of people. I was listening to a lecture by Jordan Peterson, a pretty well-known psychologist in Canada right now. He's not a Christian at all. He has a great respect for the Bible, but he's not a Christian. So it's interesting that he said this. He said, in Western culture right now, we are not mature enough to have a real serious discussion about the proper rules of human sexuality. And I was really happy that he at least recognized that, because what happened, say, in the 60s was that everything went completely wild. And, fair enough, we developed the birth control. There was this idea now that sex doesn't really take all of the same consequences, at least not necessarily, that it did before. And so everyone's like, okay, well, let's party. And then, of course, come the 70s, and then STDs. But they didn't have them before, but they become so much more serious now. We realize, the picture that we thought was so simple and so foolish of our ancestors, maybe it wasn't so simple after all. Maybe there's a lot more wisdom in the old rules that we had before. And as a matter of fact, you can see, say, on the political left, there's actually sort of, and this has been just astounding to me, that on the political left, there's almost a swing back towards much more conservative types of sexual rules. And their motivations for it are much different. The whole idea of well, I won't get into the details of it, but I think you probably know what I'm talking about. They're much more strict with sexual, I guess, rules now, and that's really astounding to me because the left was always the liberal side that were kind of, I guess, stretching us away from the initial moral rules regarding that. Now they're kind of going back that way, and a lot of it's because of the existential problems that have come about because we haven't been following those rules. So it's really interesting, and you make a good point that the Bible isn't the only thing which bears witness to the truth of these things. The truth of the moral rules that are there really are written, first of all, in the world in general, but as Paul says in Romans 1, they're really written on the heart of mankind themselves. And the fact is, well, we'll get into that more in a second. Go ahead, Quinn. Oh, okay, yeah.
That these rules of ethics exist independent of the scriptures, and you will be judged based upon these rules. Whether or not you have come to know the Bible itself, you're going to be judged based upon the truths that exist independent of the scriptures.
Right.
Because these are truths that are self-evident. They're things that exist regardless of whether you're born here in the United States or somewhere in, I don't know, the heart of Brazil. Because they're true. They're true independent of anything.
Right.
They're part of the structure of the world that God created.
Right. That's very true. And yeah, go ahead.
What I was wondering is that if those truths are there, and if they are applicable to every person, does that mean that they are within us somewhere? Is it part of our natural conscience that we either harden or develop? Or
I think
does God plant some morality within us?
I think there's a biological basis for morality, personally, because you can see the elements of it even in the animal kingdom. I was watching this TED Talk once, and the guy was talking about the concept of morality in animals, and he was showing this really funny video to me. There were these two monkeys, and small monkeys, I can't remember what kind they were. They really liked fruit much more than vegetables, and he was showing this idea of fairness and justice that was already present in monkeys. So what it did was they gave a piece of celery to one of the monkeys, and he was like, okay, that's fine. And then he saw the other monkey in the other cage, and the woman that was there gave that one a grape. And you could see that monkey start looking around, and he grabbed the celery, he chucked it at the woman. And he said, give me a grape, So it was really interesting. Another example with chimpanzees, and they were inside of an enclosure, and they had food on a wooden board on a track with two ropes attached that went into the enclosure. So what it was not one monkey could pull it to himself, but you needed two monkeys to work together in order to pull the food on the track. So what they do is they would feed one of the monkeys already, and they wouldn't feed the other one. And so this one would be he'd want the food, and he would actually help. He'd ask some other monkey to help him, even though the other monkey wasn't hungry. And he would kind of lose interest, but he would eventually, he'd kind of keep tapping him, and he'd help him. What would happen is next time the other monkey would help him. So there's this, I guess, reciprocity and justice. Those things are already in, I guess, animal DNA as well. So I think there really is a biological basis for morality. And I think what happens is we don't, as a whole in human history, we don't make, at least individually this is true, you don't make moral decisions first. First you do things. You commit action. Look at the way children act. They experiment with their own actions. I see my daughter, she throws stuff at my son, and she drops things on his head, and she does things not because she's maleficent or anything like that. It's because she wants to see what will happen. And so she learns through her actions what is harmful and what is okay, and she learns those boundaries through her actions. I think that's really the case. If you look at it, what we've done is we have developed and we've acted in the world for so many years, and we've looked at the things that we've been doing, and we've started to say, and this is true. You can look at a lot of different. I mentioned, and I'll mention more in a second. The Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. He was a Greek philosopher in the 4th century BC. And even on the foundational level, the Tao Te Ching, which is a book that was the foundation for the ancient Chinese religion, Taoism, which stretches back perhaps to almost, say, the time of, well, if you look at it historical chronologically, you kind of almost get back to the time of Noah's 3 sons. I mean, it's thousands of years ago, and there's some discrepancies there. But all in all, you've got some of these religions and philosophical systems stretching all the way back, and they have some of these same foundational concepts of, generally speaking, morality. You have the idea of, I guess, general magnanimity. We say, like Jesus said, do unto others what you would have them do to you. Confucius said something pretty similar, right? It was actually the opposite. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. I think these things, it's not that they're necessarily, we are born knowing them consciously. It's that we act them out in our lives, and then we start to become conscious of them as we see that this is simply the way the universe works. I think that's kind of how it will work. Yeah.
So I disagree with you.
Okay,
I
good.
do not think that morality is biological at all.
Okay.
I think that there is a pragmatic reason why those monkeys help each other. Is because they get mutual benefit. And this is one of the things that I think is dangerous when you are talking about it being a biologic thing, because there are plenty of examples in which morality for human beings differs dramatically from that in animals. In animals, they do things based upon either perceived or actual harm versus or benefit. And when you talk about like mothers protecting their young, that could be viewed as simply continuing on your line. That could also be some built-in from God to help keep things progressing, to keep the young safe and to survival. So what I would say though, there are plenty of different moral behaviors among people that are not learned behaviors, but are done that don't have any benefit to that individual.
Right.
So I think there's a very significant distinction, and my belief personally is that the spiritual part of us that God has created, there is definitely that soul, but I think that soul carries with it some special stuff that we have no ability to really perceive of, or that we're not perceptive enough to be aware of. And so my belief is that that moral oughtness that comes, it comes only to humans, and it's solely because our soul was created by God, who imbued that with some level of understanding of what the spiritual is.
Okay. The moral oughtness is I agree, is the distinction, of course, between humans and animals. It's not so much that the monkey consciously thinks, you should really help me. It's the right thing to do. You should help
Totally
me get that.
pragmatic.
Right, exactly. Now, but the thing is, I think when you want, what we should do is look all the way to the bottom of this, because really, I think on some level, well, we can say that generally speaking, human beings are very pragmatic as well. Not completely, like you said, there are many things we do which really that don't actually seem to be good for us at all, right? Like for instance, well, I guess it's kind of hard to think of for instance, but
well, sacrificing yourself.
Okay.
For others.
For who?
I mean, what the individuals who are, let's just say that you have, okay, I'll give you a good example. Donating a kidney to somebody who needs a kidney. So a total stranger donating a kidney to another stranger.
Right.
Number one, it causes them some degree of harm to a certain extent. You can't live with one kidney, but if that kidney goes, you're in trouble.
Right.
Number two, doing it for a stranger you don't know and who you may never have contact with again. There are people out there who donate those sorts of organs to people in need, and it benefits them in no way whatsoever.
Right. Okay, yeah, good example then. We'll work with that. Now, the thing though about I think about the pragmatism of animals even is when you get down to it. I'll get to you in a second. Sorry. when you get down to it, I think. Well, let's say if we ask, say, an atheist that question, what about those types of things? They might, I think maybe the half-baked answer they might come up with is something kind of akin to, well, you really are doing it for sort of a pragmatic reason. It's in a sense it's helping the community in which you live, it's strengthening that. So if you can make a reasonable sacrifice, which isn't, that doesn't take away too much from you, but that does, I guess, gives more than it takes. In essence, you'd say that's a very pragmatic thing. So in a sense, you could say that. Even those things are pragmatic. Or perhaps you are a Christian and you believe that you're supposed to do good acts, and why do you want to do them? He might say, well, maybe you just want to go to heaven, and so you just want a reward, and so it really is for you. And I'm not saying I'm making that argument at all, but I think that's a line of reasoning you can go down. But when you get down to it, even things which seem very pragmatic, I don't think really are. So what we're really saying is you're not doing this action because you see intrinsic value in, say, a person or a thing or an action. You're doing it because you just see, I guess, pragmatic value. But I don't think that the funny thing is I don't think that pragmatic value, it doesn't exist on the lowest level. So for instance, the mother monkey that might give up her her life for her chimp, we could say, well, that's just propagation of the species. The question is, why does she want to propagate the species? Why does she think that's a good thing that she ought to do? Which she doesn't really think anyway, not the way we do. But for the sake of the question, what's so pragmatic about that, really? Or I should say, why does she see value in that? Maybe there's intrinsic value in propagating the species. Of course, atheists don't like that idea, right? I mean, we don't want to believe that there's if you're an atheist, you can't believe in intrinsic value. It all has to be based on something else. You can't have something valuable in itself, because that really opens the door to belief in God. But I think the thing is, even if you say you do things for yourself, well, what's so great about you? Why do you have this desire to do things that are good for you? What it means is you believe that you are intrinsically valuable. So on the bottom level, there really isn't anything that's purely pragmatic in the sense we've been using it. Everyone, I think, either consciously or unconsciously believes in the intrinsic value of something. And so really, I think, in a sense, does believe in some sort of higher standard there. So I don't particularly, I guess I go around that huge bush to say that I think the idea of biological basis doesn't necessitate I guess an issue with Christianity. But I saw a couple of hands, and so we'll kind of let that go for now. We'll let them chime in. So.
Well, I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say, I'm way back to the
Oh, okay.
sexual business of
Okay,
animals and humans.
Sure.
And some people I worked with said, they're acting like nothing but animals. And I said, that is not true. Because God created animals, most animals, they only come in at a season. Everything is done. God creates animals that the only time they have sex is when they come in season, when it's their time. And human beings can breed at any time, and they have the choice to make and stuff. So when somebody says, well, they're acting like animals don't act like that.
Right. I think when a human being, when you can say that a human being acts like an animal, he's really acting worse than one. To the extent that animals do
Exactly.
dirty things, they do it unconsciously. If we're doing it on purpose, right?
And God sets them. I used to raise dogs, and it's really, there's only a few days in there that an animal will breed. I mean, God sets this all up,
Right.
and almost all animals are like that.
But there are ones that are not, Judy. So
I know
monkeys are not.
monkeys are not
That's
like
true.
that. I don't even want to talk about monkeys. I
Yeah,
wasn't going to go there.
you had your hand up.
Well, clarify a point on the animal, the mother and the baby.
Okay.
Eventually, the mother will let that baby die before her own life is taken. When it comes to animals, it happens over and over again. See it all the time. I mean, you look at different animals' world. So that's not a truism that a mother animal will die.
Right, no,
When you
no.
think about it.
That's true.
And if you look at whether it's a herd animal, eventually I'll let that one be taken by the lions or cheetahs or whatever.
Mhm.
Female lions will let the lion cubs be killed by a different male lion that comes in. So that's not a truism.
Right.
That's a made up thing for man to make themselves feel that. I want to support that we are like, but it's not the way it really works.
Right. No. You could say, I guess the point I was trying to make about animals is the things that they do, to the extent that they do nourish their young and do things that do offer some sort of sacrifice for them, right, to some degree.
I'm
There's.
just saying, there are human mothers, probably most human mothers that would die for their compared to no animal.
Right. But anyway, what I was saying about the point I was making about animals is, insofar as they would, nourish their young or make some sort of sacrifices for the good of I guess others, we could. I think this is really the issue with the atheistic line of thinking, is that you can put it down to, say, the propagation of the species or self-preservation, but underneath those things is the idea of intrinsic value. Even underneath those things, because there's the propagation of the species, what's so great about the species? Why should anything have this instinctual? Even human beings have some of these instincts, right? We have the instinct for self-preservation, but that doesn't mean my moral actions are based on some instinct, and it doesn't go any further than that. Underlying that is the idea inherently within me that me, in the self-preservation instinct, that I am actually something worth preserving. And explain that for me. What makes me think that? Nothing in this world makes me think that. And I think that goes back to something you were saying about unlearned behaviors, and that there are some things which are, I guess, and this is the difference, back to your question really, which was a long time ago now, I know, about that, which is the idea of morality. I think when I was saying that morality doesn't start consciously, I think I was talking on that type of level. It's not so much that, children, they grow up and they automatically know, as I guess propositionally, that A is wrong, B is right, and that sort of thing. We don't, think that way at first. The first thing we do is we test out the world of action. We do have unlearned behaviors, and they kind of, you might say the unconscious manifests itself in what we do. And from that, you can work and say, okay, I can articulate the things that now are wrong and now are right. And of course, you're helped along by that by parents and other influences in your life. But and of course, what I'm really saying is that when it gets down to it, it comes down to some sort of foundational, universal moral standard that can't be explained by any naturalistic processes, and it can't be explained through culture and socialization. All these things have a basis somewhere, and we understand, of course, the basis is in God. He's the highest standard of those. That's where they come from, and that's actually a pretty good segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is it's commonly called. This is important, by the way, further defining what ethics is and what morality is. It's called the Euthyphro problem. I'm saying that 3 times fast. Euthyphro. Plato was a Greek philosopher, and he wrote dialogues, which, conversations essentially usually fake or maybe based in reality, conversations between 2 people about, say, a certain subject. And there's one where his teacher, Socrates, is one of the primary characters, and he's talking to another character named Euthyphro. And they ask this question. This is where the name Euthyphro problem comes from. The question is, in his terms, since they believed in multiple gods, they said, is an action or is something right because the gods say it's right, or do the gods say it's right because it is? So we could, translate that for us who believe in the one true God, beyond all those little g gods. And we could ask ourselves the question: when we say something's right, are we saying that it's right because God said so? In other words, could God have easily said something else is right, and then that would have been right? So, for instance, he says, don't murder, right? But let's say could he have said, do murder, and that would have been right? That's sort of the question. So is something right? Is murder wrong because God said so? Or did God say it is because it's wrong? What do you think?
Well, I think that God, in his infinite wisdom and knowledge, understands perfect justice, understands perfect existence. And I think that those principles exist. I think that they are known by God and are practiced by God, but I think that they are the ultimate way to exist. So by far the best way to exist is the principles that God has before. It's not because I think that they exist, and it's hard to say that they exist independent of God, but they are concepts and principles like his perfect justice. So, for instance, God could have said that, I forgive everybody's sin, and Jesus, my son, doesn't have to die. But he didn't do that because payment had to be made. Balance sheet had to be made equal. So the debt had to be paid. There was a debt, it had to be paid. There was no other pathway. So he honored the concept of justice, of ultimate justice, by sending his son Jesus. Whereas as God, he could have just said, I'll scrap it and it's okay. Everybody can come to heaven. He could have done that, but he didn't. And the reason he did it is because that concept of justice is overarching in it, and he abides by that principle as well.
Okay, Quentin had his hand up, and then Abigail.
So they heard my spiel on this about 2 weeks ago when I talked about this.
They probably don't remember.
Infinite possibilities and the Dr. Strange proposition.
Okay.
That there's infinite possibilities, and that God chose the one reality where everything lined up properly.
Best of all possible world.
Right. That he chose the best of all possible realities, and that's the reality that we're living in.
Does that really answer the question, though, the Euthyphro problem?
I would actually say that it's both. Because he is working with perfect knowledge. Therefore, he has a realization of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a vicious cycle of yes.
Okay, that's thoroughly confusing. What did you have to say before?
I think that he created nature and life and our reality based on his truths and his essence. So I think what we have and the way that it works is based off of who God is and how he works. So that's why it's always the truth. That's why those truths exist beneath us.
Okay. Yes.
And that's what I was gonna say. God existed and God was good far before creation ever happened. And in fact, Proverbs tells us that wisdom was there with God. As he created.
Right.
So before man came into being, before there had to be any laws as far as what mankind had to do with mankind, God was there and God was already good. So, and we are to reflect God in goodness. Therefore, those were there because of who God is. Now, God is who he is because of that.
And yes.
When the Israelites divided up the land, and when the one tribe did not have any males, and they didn't get land, and they went to Moses and said, I want you to present this to God. And God said, yes, they're right, they should get it. So, I mean, God himself, I mean, in that situation, he said, yes, I see and this is only right, and he changed his mind and gave them the land. Only they couldn't, it had to stay then within that family, but they were women and they were not going to get anything. But then when Moses went back to God and said, they don't think this is fair, God said they're right. And I think that's a good example of God's being just and fair and having ethics.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So what I've, basically disseminated from all this is basically kind of yes or both, or maybe in a sense neither to the two options given by the Euthyphro problem, you could say. I know that's every answer you could give, but that's, the thing is, and this is the way I definitely, basically at least perceive it, is, the idea of God, first of all, the idea of God being subservient to something else is completely, it can't work. Because if he's God, then he's the greatest thing we can conceive of, right? I mean, he is the standard of everything. He's the highest possible being. So there can't be something higher than him. If there's something higher than him, then that is God and not him, right? By definition. So that can't work. And yet we also can't say that he is, I guess, arbitrary. That's really the other option, is that he is arbitrary in the way he went about making the rules of the universe, right? I mean, there are some things that even God can't do. James teaches us that God can't lie. No, that was Hebrews. And James teaches us that he can't tempt or be tempted. So, on some level, I think basically the something is right, not because necessarily God said it is, and he could have said something else, or because God serves some standard higher than himself. Something is right because it is a part of or manifests the character of God himself. I think, and most of you kind of gave an answer, basically to that point, really, which is that we want to apply the specifics of, say, justice in our lives because God is just, right? I mean, he's the standard of all things. He's the ultimate being, and he is infinitely just. And so us as finite beings, as beings made in his image, we will try to be in our particular smaller instances just as well. So that's a rationale, you might say, for morality. That's the reason why we would do the things that we do, and that is really important, to start with that basis in God, because that's really the only basis you can get to. It's the only legitimate one, because you can look at the different moral codes of mankind, and virtually all of them in some way fall short, because none of them really can perfectly reach towards God. Of course, we will put as an exception the scriptures. But I think the point is that the scriptures, they're not you. And the thing about people, we as moral agents, is that each of you individually, we each of us have we have our own moral propositions, our own moral beliefs. And we, of course, beyond that, we have our own moral practices. We haven't even gotten to that point yet. I mean, we're all talking about what we believe, right, as a propositional. We're talking about what we think is true, and that is completely different than what we'll actually do. Or is it? I guess that's the real question too, is what you do actually what you really believe? And that's a problem that I probably shouldn't have mentioned, because that's, that's quite a rabbit hole, getting down into that. But, for our purposes now, basically, none of us has reached even propositionally, even I think on a knowledge basis. At least I've never met anyone that has. Well, I don't know. Maybe I have. I do know this. This is all I can say, is I am not at the point where I know exactly what I would do in every situation, right? So that means there's always got to be growth for me in understanding ethics and understanding what it is to live the moral life. And I can't just make blanket statements and say, this universal truth will always apply to every situation, every conceivable situation in this particular way. It can't really work that way. It doesn't. So that's the thing is, we have the scriptures, we have, that, we have more than that, we have minds that God has given us to be able to interpret the scriptures and to, I guess, apply them to our lives. But we don't do that perfectly. I think that's the point. We can say all we want that we've got the perfect standard in the Word of God, but the thing is, that standard doesn't perfectly live inside of me. So the issue is always going to be there, and the cause and need for development will always be there too. Yes.
Yeah, talking about that is what would you do in a certain situation? Now, we saw on the news already where the country was starving and we dropped all the supplies in there.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see, mostly what happens there, the ones that are bigger and stronger, they'll run in there and they'll grab whatever they can and they carry as much as they could and they'd run off.
Mm. Instead
of thinking about the women and children and things like that. And I think as Christians, we got to be, when we become a Christian, we start getting ready for certain situations, not me, myself, and I,
Right.
on everything. So
Right.
I don't know. So, yeah, I think we have been tested in a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And ethics would help us in this.
Mm-hmm. Right. And goes back to kind of what we said at the beginning about consciously forming your own, I guess, moral compass that you can use throughout your life. Most people probably, just the average person hasn't gone about consciously trying to do that. Socrates used to say basically, well, no, he didn't say that. I said this. I forgot. I was thinking about him. He didn't actually say this. Sometimes I have fake conversations with people that in history, and that's a dangerous thing because he didn't say that. I did. The idea. So don't put this on him if it's a stupid idea. But the thing is, I think when I was thinking about people like Socrates and others who are have talked a lot about morality, and they would call themselves, or people would call them, philosophers. And essentially, there's a lot of baggage put on that word right now today, but essentially what it means in that context is the most simple meaning you can take out of the two Greek words that are put together there, which is philos and sophia, right? Love and wisdom. So basically it means a lover of wisdom, someone that wants to who wants to obtain wisdom and apply it to their lives. And morality is the manifestation of that in the world. So I think everyone in that sense is a philosopher. Everyone, in a sense, has at least the responsibility, if not the desire, to obtain wisdom. Now, the fact is, some of us are better at it than others. I think that's really what it comes down to, is a lot of us don't consciously try to work towards wisdom. And there are three main things that I see as being summed up in Christ that philosophers have really tried to chase after since the beginning of time. There's truth, of course, knowing true things. There's goodness, there's doing good things, and then there's beauty, I think, which is a harder concept. Again, that's quite a rabbit hole, but I think when you get down to the bottom of it, if you put truth and goodness together, then you've got beauty. That's sort of as far as I can tell, that's the essence of what beauty is when everything, you have right beliefs and right actions, and they're put together, and it makes a beautiful life. So those three things, they're sort of the pillars for all of the endeavors of mankind, all of the noble endeavors. And it's really amazing to me that Jesus, when he comes to earth, he says in John 14:6 that he's all three of those. He says, I'm the way, which is a very old term which has been used to refer to the practice and study of ethics since thousands of years ago. The Tao, I mentioned the Tao Te Ching, the Taoism, that basically translated, you could translate Tao as the way. So Jesus comes and he says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the light, which can be loosely associated with the idea of light. In him was life, and the light is the light of men, or glory, which in the Bible is always associated with the beauty of God. And so he's basically saying, I am those three things, the true, the good, and the beautiful in one. And insofar as you pursue any of them, you're really trying to pursue a relationship with the divine. And so really, ethics is where the rubber meets the road. You can believe in true things propositionally, and you can sort of appreciate beauty in sort of a passive spectator, haphazard type of way. But to put them all together really and manifest them in your life that's essentially what ethics is. It's doing things and doing good things, and that's really where everything that a human being is manifested, is in the realm of your actions. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to amend my previous statement.
Okay, which one?
Just from the standpoint of
Well, he made several.
suggesting that there was a concept that existed outside of God. So I don't believe that.
Okay.
So I believe that nothing exists outside of God.
Mm-hmm.
But there are principles of himself, such as perfect justice, that he cannot, that he will not violate.
Right.
And so I was thinking about 2 Timothy 2:13. It says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself.
Right.
So there are principles about himself that he is not going to violate, perfect justice being one of those.
Right.
And so,
so
nothing exists outside of God.
Right.
Everything that is in existence, including every concept that we have about how our universe works, comes from.
Right. And so to rationalize that a little bit more, God can act basically as subject and object. So he is, we might say, the standard of truth and love, right? The Bible says your word is truth, the word is God. So God is truth. God is love. And yet he can subjectively interact with himself that way. That's, essentially what we mean when we say God exists as three in one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He can, interact both objectively and subjectively with himself. So he can interact even with his own principles. And to say that God could do something which is evil is just as intrinsically impossible as saying that there can be, say, a circular square or something to that nature. So, right, okay, very good, thank you. Yes, Clint.
That's also confused. Can you just give a brief discussion of what we mean whenever we say the universal versus the particular? Because for the discussion of ethics, it's really important.
What do we mean?
As in,
what do I mean?
What is the term in philosophy, whenever you talk about the universal versus the particular, what does that mean?
Well, okay, universal would mean applying over
I know
every...
you've studied this, I know I've studied this, but I don't know if everybody...
I don't know if I've studied it. But the idea, at least the way I've been using universal, you could say, let's see, I'm trying to think of an example, and I can't really think of one.
I've heard it used in relationship with grace, but I really don't like that, because it's always linked to Calvinists.
I see.
But the idea of universal grace, God sends the sunshine and the rain on the unjust and the unjust, versus the particular, which is the grace that we receive through him. The reason why I said I don't particularly like that example is because Calvinists then take that to the extreme of, there's some people who get that and some people that don't. There's nothing you can do to change that.
Right,
But,
right. That wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
Well, universal, and as I've been using it, just simply means it applies to everyone, in every situation. So if it's a universal principle, it isn't just particular to, say, 21st century Christian America. It would also apply to 6th BC century Taoist China. That would be my definition of universal. And when I was talking about the taking biblical principles, and essentially what I try to do, especially in today's world, is you take the biblical principle and you try to make it universally accessible to people that are not, I guess, familiar with the scriptures as such. So basically, you take the idea, say, of, we talked about sexual morality and the rationale behind, which we'll hopefully get into in the next few lessons too, somewhat. The rationality behind, why you should have these certain rules for your life, instead of just saying, well, the scriptures say so. Because, you might be talking to this Buddhist monk who's like, well, I don't believe in your scriptures. You can start on another level. In other words, you can make them universally accessible because, as I believe it, the principles in the scriptures are universal, which means they don't just apply to, say, people that happen to read them. They apply to everyone, whether or not they have read them. And as Clinton mentioned, I think, or maybe multiple people here have mentioned, the truth of God exists universally. It isn't just contained by the Bible, right? It just exists. Of course, God, or the Word of God, and in the person of Jesus Christ exists in heaven. And so he, he's not contained by just the scriptures. That's just how we consciously come to know him. So anyway, that's a discussion on, my definition of universal. Thank you for mentioning that. Now it's top of the hour. Should I stop now? How long do we usually go?
Till midnight.
Well, stay away from the windows. Long fall. What do you think? Okay. That'll take a second.
Just hit the record thing again.
Okay. Oh, there's a pause button.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Let's see. You may have to edit this some. So you may have to edit this video some. I mean, I don't know. I am recording it now. I didn't know I don't know who's staying or who's going. Or if they're ready, I don't know if they're ready yet, but I started recording it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, before I do kind of get into more of a discussion, become more discussion oriented, I just wanted to, there are a few things, the way I usually do this is I have, basically speaking the material, but I usually jump off of it, especially if any of you have, things you'd rather talk about and questions that come up and comments, that sort of thing. So because of that, there are just a few things I did want to mention just really quickly. And the first one was, I guess, well, I'm trying to decide what I should say for next week, because some of these things, like I said, you kind of get into them and it can take a lot of time to unpack. So I think, let's see. I mentioned earlier the what's called the Aristotelian idea of moral states of character. So it really answers I guess I'll phrase this as a question. Really, we can kind of go at it this way. How does one become moral in the first place? Like, at what point would you say that you are a moral person? He's looking right at us. Well, you guys haven't said anything yet, so that's why I'm asking you, right? Do you consider yourself a moral person? Yes. Okay. So what has constituted your morality? What makes you a moral person? Okay. You can think about it, and I'll ask. Well, how about you? Do you consider yourself a moral person?
I do now, but I wasn't always. I knew what was right and wrong, but I chose to do wrong a lot of times.
Okay.
Like I remember being with some friends of mine when I was in high school, and I took something out of the store, and I felt so bad afterward, but I didn't feel bad enough that I went back. Well, if I told you what I took, you'd understand why I didn't go back, but it's bothered me the rest of my life. And I think as you do wrong things, and if you don't make those things right, you know what I mean? You have to go and right those things then.
Okay.
To become, I think, a moral person.
Okay. So what about an instance in which you couldn't fix something you've done that was wrong, right?
Well,
so for instance, you did something wrong to someone and they're dead. You can't fix it with them.
Yes.
So what would you say in that condition? Could that person become moral, or is he doomed to immorality?
No. I think that's where Jesus comes in.
Okay. Have you had time to think? What makes you a moral person? Okay, well that's fine. One thing I do, I know not everyone's comfortable doing this, but you see, I've done it so much that I've gotten over the embarrassment of it to some degree, is when I don't know how to articulate something, I just kind of start talking, and you say a lot of stupid things, but eventually the truth comes out, and it takes some time. You may have noticed me do that even in this class. It's just kind of how it works. Sometimes you've got to just put it out there, but that's fine. I'll leave this. So there will be a homework assignment for you to think about. And this is, I think, the point of the whole class is to think about, am I a moral person? Can I honestly say that I am? Because, this isn't just a theoretical class, right? It's not just supposed to be something where, you think about it, are the interesting truths that we go over interesting points. It's supposed to be something that changes you. And I think, when we talk about the love of wisdom, and when we say philosophy, when we say love of wisdom, we're not just talking about this propositional knowledge, right? We're talking about being a whole person, right? And kind of think of it, as I mentioned, this question is kind of founded on the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And he said in that book that he mentioned people that talked about morality, he called them sophists, which were people in ancient Greece that were, they were teachers, and they would teach you, basically you could pay them and they'd teach you how to be really good at speaking. But it wasn't really about real wisdom or knowledge. It was really about just kind of tricking people. So they were called the sophists. And so you can kind of, we have that phrase even today. It's someone that's kind of just made of air. You're not really, there's nothing really firm and there's no integrity inside of you. And so, that's the thing about any sort of study is you shouldn't just know some things about it and know enough to kind of get by or to trick people into believing a certain way or to listening to you. You want to make yourself into a real person. That's sort of the idea. And so this study really shouldn't be just a matter of thinking. It should be a matter of trying to I guess, enact those thoughts and really, in that sense, try to understand who you are and what the direction you want to go. So think about it. And yes, you hang with it.
Was your question, how do you become a moral person?
Yes. It kind of, a couple of them. How do you become one? Why would you consider yourself one? Which kind of, asks the same thing. What makes you moral? How did you become?
I think people in general become moral when they desire to have a clean conscience and live beyond rules that just serve themselves.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
In order to be moral, you have to have some sort of standard in which to base that morality.
Okay.
For me as a Christian, of course, my morality is in God's will. Am I a moral person? I'm only a moral person through Christ. I try to be moral, but I fail.
But that doesn't mean you're not a moral person, though, right?
No, I said I have been made moral through Christ. That's my belief. That's what's true for me. But
so your morality isn't based in your actions, but in, say, the actions of Christ.
Well, I just gave a lesson yesterday that the point of the whole thing is my identity is no longer me. I identify with God. So that puts a whole different shift on how I look at everything.
Definitely. So what would you say then, in light of that fact, how do your actions particularly relate to, or how should they relate to that relationship with God? So in other words, we're asking Paul's question, can we therefore continue in sin that grace may abound?
God forbid.
No, I mean, do I literally want to be perfect and never make any mistakes? Of course. And do I strive to reach a point where I can systematically eliminate sins in my life? Do I work towards that? Yes. Do I make mistakes? Of course I do.
Right. Okay. I think it's good. Basically, what you've said for us has freed us, because the fact is, of course, we all want to be moral, but the fact also is that we aren't, and there's only one way that we can be justified in God's eyes, and that's through the sacrifice of Christ. And our being one with Him, that's how we achieve that. That's a gift. Now, because of that gift, of course, we try to be more and more like Him, and so basically, we still have that responsibility. But we've been freed from the consequences of our failures. And as Abigail and I were talking about just during the break, that the interesting thing about Christianity is that when Jesus comes, He doesn't give us a completely new set of morals that nobody ever knew about before. I mean, the ideas of loving your neighbor and that sort of thing, people knew that, we know instinctively, but that's the way you ought to live your life. The problem for us is that we haven't always done those things. And just because you're a good person, maybe you're in a court of law and you're a murderer, and you say, well, Judge, I've done a lot of community service and I give a lot of money to the poor, so I'm not guilty of murder. The judge is like, well, no, that's not how it works. You can do all the good in the world, but if you've done evil, you're still guilty. That's what Christ has done for us, is He's given us that opportunity to not be guilty anymore. He's taken the punishment for our sin. So now we try to live like Him as much as we can, But the salvific aspect of that, of course, is based in him. But of course, we're still in the world. We're saved now, but we're on the other side of life, you might say, on this side where we have to make these moral decisions, and we're not perfect, and so we need to still think about our actions, and in doing this, we can try to make them better and make our lives of higher quality. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, and I know this is probably just because this is the way we always talk, but the fact was that I think it was said that, can we do this? Well, no, we can't. Well, yes, we can. Do we do this? No, we don't. That's a different distinction, because Christ had no supernatural ability not to sin. But yet, as a man, he still did not sin. We could do that. We could. We don't. And could and do are two different things.
That's right.
And I'm not saying that I do, because I fail.
Right.
But I could.
That's probably a good question to ask next. That idea, because not everyone agrees with that. Even a lot of Christians have asked this a lot of different venues. If I wanted to, from this point on, is it theoretically possible that I never sin again? A lot of people would say no. And it's an important question. Did you have your hand up? I didn't want to jump ahead. I thought I saw a hand over here.
Well, we were talking about that idea of why Christ is necessary.
Oh, okay. Sure,
I
we can go to
learned
that
in
first.
one of my college religions classes, he talked about the idea that the Ten Commandments were rudimentary laws for immature people. I mean, it was a starting point, and that's why we need Christ. We need something beyond the starting point.
Right. I perceive that the Old Testament is basically teaching this one lesson: consequences for immoral actions. I mean, that's what the whole Old Testament is filled with. The idea is the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. You need to understand, you do this, and what you put out into the world is what's going to come back to you. You reap what you sow. That's something the Israelites understood after all their years of history, where they've gone up and down and gone into chaos and turmoil, and have come back. I mean, the fear of God, that's the beginning of wisdom. But it's not the end, right? Fear should turn to love. That's the idea that Jesus comes back. This perfect love drives out fear. So it's not just a need love anymore. It's not just a fear. It's an honest desire, an actual desire in you to be good, not just to avoid punishment, but to develop a true relationship with Christ. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to say too, when I was always under the assumption before I really started studying this out, where when Jesus was tempted, he was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by the devil. And then some people think, well, he overcame that. But it says the devil left him for a season. So his whole life he was being tempted.
Right. That was sort of the round one, you might say.
Right.
Ding.
Yeah, or the first match, 40 rounds. Well, 3 rounds, right, if you count preaching. Anyway, that's the second one. Let's see, there was something else about what you said. The foundation, the rudimentary principles that are for immature people that you have to move beyond. Carl Jung, who's a psychologist, I'm increasingly surprised at how few people know about him, interestingly, but he had this really interesting idea which parallels something that Paul said. Jung thought that human beings in general have become more conscious as time has gone on. Now, him particularly, I think he was working from an evolutionary standpoint, and I don't think that's necessary to believe this, but basically from his idea is that people have been less conscious in times past, and you can really see a pretty strong historical argument for this. But I was thinking about it in terms of what Paul said about the law. He said the law was like a tutor to bring us to Christ, and he was talking about sort of growing up into the mature man, and that really is the thing which characterizes and explains what it is to grow up, is that you're becoming more and more conscious. You're aware of the world in which you live, and you're aware of yourself and your feelings and of what you ought to be doing. And so that idea that the Old Testament was sort of, it's the Hebrew or the Greek in Romans, where Paul uses that phrase for tutor, is more of it's the type of thing I've seen in reading the Plato and Aristotle. They mention there's multiple times they'll be talking, say, rich aristocrat, and they'll have their son, And he'll ask, I remember one time he asked, in one of the books, he asked a question, who have you put your son under to learn? Which tutor have you chosen? And there'll be some famous, philosopher of the city. Oh, I put my son under him. That's really the idea that Paul's talking about.
There is no English word that correctly translates that term.
Right, because tutor has changed too.
Right.
I mean,
There's no. It was generally a slave who their only job was to teach, and we don't think about this. Slaves were generally really well educated at that time because they had to have a purpose for their existence, and that's.
Yeah, we had to know something.
Multiple jobs. One of them was to discipline. Another was to teach. Another one was to help them form a morality. So,
right. So you're developing this young child, and your parent has, if you're rich enough to do this, of course, you put this person onto your child, and he is developing him in intellectually, morally, physically, every way as he grows older. And that's what Paul's saying about the Old Testament, is that it was leading us to something else. It was helping us to grow up, to become the mature man. And so you're right about that. There's a starting point in. And you could say, that's true for a Jew. That's not true, say, for a Greek. They don't have that same starting point. But I think Paul makes it pretty clear what the starting point they do have is. In Romans 1, as we mentioned, there's the idea that even though they're without the law, that is the written law, they have the law written on their hearts. And you can see, that's why I study people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, because you can see the manifestation of that law written on their hearts when it's written in their text. So that's the basis they're coming from, are those things. And from that, you also have to, I guess, grow into the mature man. And that also has been pointing people to Christ. That's been the idea. And if you look at the history of it, Ben Shapiro has talked about this a lot, this concept of union of Jerusalem and Athens, which is the idea that when Christianity came, essentially what happened was that, as it becomes more and more Hellenized, they were able to sort of understand everything they had talked about in Greek philosophy and mythology through the lens of Christ now. They kind of understood, I can see where there was truth in that now that I believe in Christ. I can kind of have a broader, more universal worldview because of those things. So these are starting points. And the fact is, I guess, if you want to make a practical application of that for us, is we all have individually some sort of starting point. And even if you're someone that's grown up in the church, you still have a starting point which is less than perfect, right? Because you didn't get exposed from an early age just to the full light of Christ himself. You were exposed through the teachings of your parents. Your parents are flawed people, and your own understanding is flawed a lot of times as well. So we all have starting points. Yes, at least some of you are. And so we all have our starting points, which are less than perfect. The idea is that we grow towards Christ, and that is away from the fear and towards love, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. So we kind of course, got off a little bit on this, but the idea of morality, as Aristotle put it, I think is really the best for defining what makes a moral person. Now, the first thing you need, as he says, is there's first of all underlying an intellectual knowledge. There's the propositional idea or understanding of this is right and this is wrong. You need to know those things, right? Because it's not, and we believe this as Christians, it's not so much that you'll be saved by what you know. I mean, if that were the case, if you had to know everything instead of do things, right? Well, we'd all go to hell, I imagine, because none of us know perfectly. So it's not knowledge itself that saves, but the thing is, if you don't know what to do, then you can't do it. And I was also, Quentin, Abigail, and I were talking about the idea that you can't really say that you've done a moral action if you haven't done it consciously. If you haven't meant to do it. If you did it on accident, right, then it's not really a moral action. And you can kind of say vice versa for the other thing. If you did something evil on accident, you might say, like I mentioned, accidentally falling over and tripping Abigail, as opposed to purposely pushing her. There are some degrees of fault found there. But that's the idea, is you have to know. There needs to be this sort of intellectual knowledge underlying it. But then from that comes practical wisdom. There's not just what is right. There's how to apply that in your life. And you have to know that first. And from that practical wisdom comes the actions themselves. Good actions performed consistently over a period of time, which makes habitually good patterns of living. So what essentially we're saying is that a moral person is someone who has that moral state of character. And a state of character is developed by habitual action. So, that's the thing. If that's the case, then for our purposes at least, when we say someone's moral, we don't mean they've never made a mistake in their life. What we mean is that, generally speaking, if you look at the vast, I guess the big picture of their lives, they consistently perform moral actions as opposed to immoral ones. So we can say they have that moral state of character. So what we're saying then isn't, that if somebody who generally does good and then every now and then slips up and does bad, we're not saying that's an immoral person. Now, that's definitely true, and we should understand that within the Christian system, right? I mean, we also understand the point we made earlier about how everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we all need Christ to take care of that fact. But within that context, then there's the idea that we try to be consistently moral over a long period of time. Yes.
Is that what Paul was getting at in Romans 7, where he said, without the law, he was innocent and took to where he would die.
I don't quite follow you, but that's probably because I'm getting tired. Could you repeat the question again?
Okay, he says without the law, he was free. He didn't.
Oh yes, okay.
He didn't know no sin.
Right.
When the law came, that condemned him.
Right. It says that when the law came, sin kind of took hold by the law, and he died.
Right,
There's sort of a personal death that happened there. Yeah, and the thing about, and that really mirrors as far as I can tell, the development of children, right? I mean, it's funny. We always talk against the idea of original sin, which is fair enough. The idea that I am just inherently sinful and guilty, that's ridiculous. But we do have a natural capacity to do evil, and that's clear from a very early age. And you can't tell me that that's not true, because I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she definitely does things, and she knows what she's doing is wrong, and she is sometimes, hope she's not listening right now. She's, she can be, there's that, mischievous maliciousness that's always there, and it just comes up, It's not like she saw me push her brother off the couch. I didn't do that. But she tries to do stuff like that. And that's the thing is but you're in that state, you're not really aware of what you're doing. She's, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, you kind of learn morality through your actions. You have to make the mistakes first before you can kind of figure out what's right and what's appropriate. So she's in that phase. She's not guilty of those things because she's not aware of the law, right? But the thing is, eventually she will be. The law will become alive in her because she'll become conscious, and then she will die because she'll understand what she's doing is wrong, and she'll still do it. And that's a really terrible thing to think about as her father, but it's happened to me, and it's happened to all of us, and that's exactly what Paul is saying. Yes.
With what Ralph said about what Paul said, that essentially it's another reason why Christ was necessary, because if you don't have Christ, you have condemnation, but you don't have salvation.
Right. Exactly. There's no hope whatsoever. Yes. Now we're about 5 minutes till we have to leave, and I wanted to go through just one thing real quick, and then I'll kind of leave us with a moral dilemma that I want to talk about more next week. But we can at least introduce it tonight. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was, or the last thing really, was since we've talked about basing our moral decisions on the character of God, I think what we've done is sort of created but a basic, you might say, a hermeneutic for making moral decisions, a basis on which we make those ethical choices. I guess you could call it basically it's a theological methodology. That's what I'll call it, right? There's a method for how do you make moral choices in your life, and it's based in God. So it's theological. It's based in God. And there are 3. I think this is just something I've come up with and thought that this makes the most sense. When you say what should I do that's right, and what is a right action, but particularly in a situation, which will come up across these in the next few classes, and like I said, I'll introduce one in a second. You'll come across, say, a moral dilemma or a situation. You have to ask, okay, what am I basing my decision on? Why am I going to decide to do X over Y? Okay, so I think the first primary principle is one, as we already mentioned, is the divine attribute. What is God like, right? And from that understanding of what God is like, we can disseminate that down into, okay, so then this is the universal principle. This is the universal truth, which is true. Now, then there's the next question, which is, how do I take that divine attribute in the form of a universal principle and make it fit this specific situation? So it's got to start at the top, essentially, with God, and come down to you in that particular situation. Now, but those are 3 primary basic principles. That makes sense as far as I can tell. But then there are some secondary ones, and when we study the scriptures, we see a few things, like we see universal mandates, right? So we see commands in the scriptures which will say, this is how you would act in, say, this particular situation. And it's applied across different spectrums, right? It's something which we see, this is always the way you would act, right? And so that would be, you'll fall under a universal mandate. And so in that case, we don't really have to necessarily go through that initial process of, okay, I got to figure it out. What's God like? So what's the principle? So how do I apply it here? Because a lot of times people in the Bible have already gone through that same situation or a situation similar to it. So you can look and see, okay, I see what happened here and this is what God said to do. So basically what you've done is you've done the same process. It's just that you did it through reading the scripture. The scripture in a sense does it for you. Now I'm a fan of doing the process anyway, not because you don't trust the scriptures, but because you want to make this your decision. And I think to make a moral choice yours, you have to go through as often as you can, the process of rationalizing why you're doing what you're doing, why you believe what you believe. So there's that universal mandate. There's also, of course, a more tricky principle that we find, or a tricky thing we find in the scriptures, which is historical precedent, right? We see not just what God has commanded in the scriptures, but we also see what God's people have done. And that's a tricky one because it's not clear to me by any stretch that you always have to do exactly what they did the way they did it. And, obviously the scriptures don't teach that in every context. So for instance, do you guys do foot washing here? No, okay, I didn't think so. I mean, most of us don't.
Some people need to.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing, we have examples of that in the scriptures, and yet we don't follow that. So there's, sometimes a distinction between, I guess, historical precedent being something that just happened and something that we need to follow. And again, that's another rabbit hole that we don't need to necessarily go down. But often you will look at that, and it's at the very least, if it's not a requirement to use those examples, which you can definitely, like I said, I won't get into the argument. At the very least, I think we all can agree that there are many instances in the scriptures where what they did was the wisest way to go about doing, say, a particular action. And taking the advice of, that counsel is really, really the best thing we could do. I mean, God had it written down there for a reason. I think it's here for us for a reason. So historical precedent is important. And as a final principle, though, there's also something you need to take into consideration in studying the scripture for informing your moral life, which is personal conviction. And Paul talks about this, especially in Romans 14. There are going to be times when, because of your upbringing and your background and things that have happened to you in your life, you're going to feel wrong about something that perhaps the scriptures don't actually say is wrong. So in the instance in Romans 14, it was a lot of people thought that eating meat sacrificed to idols was something that was just completely wrong. Paul says it's just meat. The idol it's not even a real God. If it's just meat, if you're not really worshiping the idol, it's okay to eat the meat. However, a lot of people used to be in that particular city and church. They were pagans. They used to worship those idols. So eating that meat was really, it was bothersome to them. And so what he said was, whatever is not of faith is sin. If that bothers you, if that, I guess, pricks your conscience, do not do it. Even if you can kind of on an intellectual level understand, it's probably not that bad. And I can think about that for a lot of different things. There are some things that I was perhaps taught were wrong as a child. And I grew up and I realized, there's really nothing wrong with that per se. And yet the thing is, since it was, pounded into me from a young age, it really would be quite impossible, at least initially, for me to go ahead and conscientiously do those things. And so that's something you also need to take into account, is not just what the Bible says and what God says and what they did, and not just those primary principles of who God is and how we would take that principle of who God is and apply it to our situations, but also what can I do honestly? And that's probably where, again, the rubber meets the road for us, because we need to make sure that we are living, what would be the word for that? You're living with integrity, right? You're never doing something which you feel to be wrong. And that's really the important thing, because what we're dealing with really at the bottom of it is our own perceptions of right and wrong. And we try to perfect them. That doesn't mean truth is relative. It means we'll never figure it out completely. So the idea of understanding God completely, that's impossible. What we can try to do is discern the will of God in our particular situations. And if we do something which is against our conscience, Paul says that's wrong. So, we need to take those things into consideration when we talk about and think through, I guess, certain situations and moral dilemmas. And speaking of which, after we have one more comment, I will, as we close, introduce this situation to you, and we'll talk about it next week. But what did you have to say?
Well, we had a situation where years ago I would have kept it. We found money in Walmart laying on the floor rolled up.
Mm.
And we took the money to the service desk and they said, why are you doing this? Just keep it. Because the paperwork that we have to fill out for this, just keep it. I said, no, we can't keep it. I said, somebody may come back for it. They said, do you have any idea what this is? Just keep it. I said, no, morally, we can't keep it. And then my niece worked there and she said, what, you think a little bit of money is going to make you go to hell? And I said, well, I am not going to take the chance.
Mhm.
Morally, I am not going to keep it.
Mhm.
You do it what you want to with it then, but we are not keeping it.
Right.
So therefore, we had a chance to not only, but to tell them the reason why we were not doing it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and it's a perfect illustration of that idea that, it sounds perhaps cliche, but you've got to be true to yourself. You can argue on that basis, right? You could say, well, maybe I could see your point of view, but when it comes down to it, this is how I feel about it. So if I act against that, I know I'm doing wrong. And that's the thing about the conscience, is it can be overzealous, right? You can say, or you can think something's wrong when it's not, but it can also be hardened. We understand that. It can be seared. We can believe some things are right when they're not.
But then
And so
once
go ahead.
we gave it to her,
Mhm.
then it was their choice
Right, that's true.
and not ours any longer. And
Right.
we stood up for what we believed was right.
Right,
Now,
that's all you
years
can do.
ago, if they
Yeah.
would have said, keep it, I'd have said, okay,
Yeah.
I'm free.
Right. Okay, so here's the situation. I want to talk about a lot of things. We'll get much more specific, although I'm glad that multiple specific issues were brought up tonight. I was really happy about that, either by me or by you. But I want to talk about some of the things that specifically in the Churches of Christ we talk about quite a lot and perhaps argue about a lot, and there's some confusion on. And some of them I've been really debating whether or not to mention them because of the, just the inevitable disagreements that will come up, because they always do. But we'll see how it goes. For now, this one's a little bit more safe, but here's the dilemma as it's been delivered to me. Okay, so you're in your home at night. Say you've got a couple of daughters. Let's say you're a guy who's got a couple of daughters. You're a guy right now. And you've got two daughters, let's say, that are upstairs. And it's nighttime and you're in your house and you know that there's this, serial killer rapist that's escaped from prison and they haven't found him yet. And that's night, this serial killer rapist smashes into your living room and takes you down, and he's got a gun and he's pointing at your head. And he asks you, is there anyone else in the house? Should you lie and say no? Or are you morally obligated to tell the truth?
No.
Oh, I didn't ask for an answer yet. I was going to say, next week, same time. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. I was wondering if I'll pause this, but I was wondering if I could close with just a short prayer. Is that fine? Quinton?